the good friends, the ones we hold dear, the ones who will tell us what we need to hear, the ones who love us, right or wrong, and to all those good friends that give you this song.
Well, hello, good friends, and welcome back to The Last Walk, Remember When, with your host, Ron Baumbach. And today, we're going back in time again to the fun times. So get up, get off your easy chair, walk over to your ice box, reach way in the back, take out an orange crush, open it up, get that tall glass filled with ice, sizzle and fizzle as you pour it in the glass. It tickles your nose. And reach up into the cupboard. Take out a nice clock bar. Unwrap it. Sit back in your easy chair. Turn on your lava lamp. Close your eyes. Get ready. It's storytelling time. The Last Walk is back.
Oh, I've been so lucky and I've been so blessed. In spite of my failings, I've found success. For I've known love, and I've known good times, and I have known friendship, and written some rhymes.
Friends, we've been doing a multi-part series about the saga of my back. You see, back in 1964 and 65, I spent about 6 months on my back in a hospital bed in St. Charles Hospital, a great place out in Port Jefferson, Long Island, New York, for a thing called scoliosis, curvature of the spine, which was discovered by a Robert Hall salesman, and a number of doctors then did a number of great things to get my back much better. It was an incredible, interesting ordeal, but a lot of fun-filled things with some great memories, many of which made me who I am today, and I'm very thankful to my family and the doctors and the staff and my friends and everybody who helped me throughout this wonderful time in my life. Sounds kind of funny saying wonderful time in my life, but it truly was. I got to meet a number of really nice people, got to know different side of life, and basically over the course of my time in the hospital, my number of roommates totaled 25. Many became distant memories. A few memories lasted for a long time. One fellow was a minor league baseball player who was a teammate of Mickey Mantle's. I really enjoyed this guy's stories. We only shared a room for about 4 or 5 days, but this guy was about maybe 40, 50, 60 years old. I forget his age, but he had stories about the Mick and about baseball back in the old days when he played in the minor leagues. Don't know where it was, maybe Columbus, but it was way back when. And then there was a man named Hank White. Now, Hank was somewhat of a cantankerous gentleman of about 65, who I learned was in for a routine operation. Hank didn't have much of a family and didn't really want to talk to the nurses. He wanted to talk to nobody, but for some odd reason, he would only speak to me. He would lay in bed, I lay in my bed, about 10 feet apart, and we would talk about life and about things happening, and if he needed a pill, needed some pain medication, he'd ask me to call the nurses. When the nurses would come in, he wouldn't talk to them, he'd turn to me, I would tell the nurse what Hank's problem was. This would go on for days and days. Probably about a week we were in the room together. It was very strange and surreal in a way. This man trusted me with basically being his voice to the nurses. I knew we could talk, everyone knew we could talk, but he would not discuss anything with anyone else except me. Now one day as Hank laid in bed, I noticed strange gurgling sounds coming from him. It was really frightening. I had no idea what was going on. I rang the nurse's button and yelled for help. They came running in and took him away. Days later, he returned again to the bed next to me. But the only problem was, he actually could no longer speak. Hank had had a stroke, and Hank lost the ability to speak even to me. Now Hank continued his uncooperative ways with the nurses and the staff whenever they tried to care for him. It was painful for them as they tried so hard to basically work with him and help him, but he ignored their request. I started talking to Hank when the nurses were there and they went out of the room, and I tried to reason with them, me talking and Hank listening. He responded with his eyes. I then became his ears and his voice. In a weird sense, we could relate to each other. And the nurses would ask me to ask the questions to Hank. Here I am 15 years old, a man 50 years my elder. We had a bond. Hank and I, basically, me being his voice and his ears, and just talking for him and letting people know from what he told me through the look in his eyes. It was unbelievable. I would ask Hank. He would visually respond back to me, look at the nurses. Nurses took note and tended to his care. I felt so truly special that I was indeed helping my good friend Hank. We were only together about 2 weeks maybe, but we had a bond. The two of us could, when he was talking, we would talk about everything about life. It was amazing the faith I had in this man and he had in me. He was 15 years old, he's 65, and we had this bond. Now it came time to me to eventually go home on June 1st, I believe 1965. And I had to be discharged. First time basically leaving the hospital for good after 6 months. And my roommate was Hank. So we had our own goodbyes together as I talked to him and he looked at me and I saw some tears in his eyes and basically we said goodbye. Now a few days later, I called the hospital to speak to Hank, hoping someone would put the phone next to his ear. As I asked to be connected to him, the operator simply said, "Are you family?" Now knowing Hank had virtually no family, I hesitated and I said, "Yes." She then proceeded to tell me, unfortunately Mr. White passed away earlier that week. It was the most empty feeling. I hung up and said a silent prayer for my friend Hank. I have never ever forgotten Hank White. He was a special, calm, gentle man. He reminded me in many, many ways of my own dad, who sadly ended up communicating in a very similar way a number of years later. Hank White, rest in peace.
Life is too short, we get only one turn. With luck we find beauty, but we sometimes get burned. But if you've had a true friend, or perhaps love, you've experienced the peace of heaven above.
But by far, my very best friend in the hospital during my time there was a priest, our chaplain, Father Moynihan. He was a Montfort priest, also I believe a pastor or the associate pastor of St. Ignatius, I believe it was, out in Port Jefferson. And he spent a lot of time at St. Charles. He would come to see me every day, or it felt like that, and we would talk about everything. We would sit and chat about baseball, about life. He knew I loved the Mets, and we'd talk about the games, this season, the players. He was thrilled when Larry Bernard came to visit me. He'd bring me communion. We would talk about, you name it, whatever it was, Father Moynihan was there for me. An older man back then, but he still had the spirit and the spunk of a youngster. He was a wonderful, caring gentleman who would surprisingly appear at just the right time, whenever I really needed him. If I was lonely or upset or something happened where I didn't feel right, he would all of a sudden have a supernatural sense of being and be at my bedside. When my mind would go astray, he would bring it back. Now, I was suddenly discharged on a June Sunday, I think it was June 1st, 1965, in the morning, while he was in church saying Mass. Sadly, while thrilled to go home, I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my good friend, the Reverend Father Moynihan. Later that day, he came to visit me, I heard, and he saw my now empty bed, empty. After all those months in the hospital, I was not there. In the mail, a few days later, came a very official-looking summons. It seems I have broken a true bond of friendship, he wrote, because I did not tell him I was going home. I didn't know I was going home. The doctor walked in that morning. I was laying in bed. I had no clue I'd be going home that day. The doctor said to me, "Can you get out of bed?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "If you can walk, you can go home." So they got me out of bed. I stood next to the bed, holding on for dear life. He said, if you can make it across the room, you go home today. I said, I'm going to try my best. So I gingerly galloped, so to speak, pun, across the room from bed to bed. And the doctor looked at me and said, okay, you're good to go. Call your mom and dad. Tell them to pick you up. I was flabbergasted. So I get this package in the mail from Father Moynihan. It contained pages and pages and pages of funny jokes. It was classic. It was really cool. And I've saved that to this day, which I do many, many weird things, which my wife knows so well. And I recently went to a retreat with the Moynihan priest, and I mentioned Father Moynihan to him. And I recalled to him the packet that Father Moynihan had sent me. But in it, Father Moynihan said, in written at the very end, please don't share this with anyone. They'll think I'm nuts. So I didn't share it. Now that summer, Dad and I visited Father Moynihan at his retreat house out on Long Island. It was really great. Two friends, strongly separated by multiple generations. I mean, he must have been 70 years old, and I was a mere 15. But emphatically, we were bound by a strong allegiance to each other. Now, many, many years later, I heard where he lived and went alone to visit him again. I was now about 35 or 40. I was led to this quiet, lonely room, and out came a very elderly man who reminded me so much of my dad, who had just succumbed to Alzheimer's. And Father Moynihan was indeed there in body form. He walked over to me, I walked over to him. We looked at each other. I recognized him immediately, even though he was older. He didn't know me. He had no idea who I was. It truly bummed me out. My dad and Father Moynihan, so close to each other in time and age. Why did this happen to both of them?
Did you ever know that you're my hero? And everything I would like to be.
So I was brought down in a wheelchair to leave the hospital. As Mom and I waited for Dad to get the car to drive us back home that memorable Sunday for my discharge from the hospital after being in bed for 6 months, Mom and I sat in the lobby, me in that mandatory, crazy four-wheel wheelchair, which I could not wait to get out of, and Mom sitting next to me, proud to get me back home. Now, since the back of my head was either in a cast or flattened down in bed for 6 months, I had grown very long hair, the nape of my neck. To say it was very long would be an understatement. It was also the early beginnings of an era when the hippie-type characters were not really socially accepted. As we sat there in the lobby, some older women happened to walk by. They made note of my long hair and uttered some really sarcastic comments under their breath. My mom heard this, and she ripped into them. It was classic. Mom was at her best. Don't you say that about my son. You have no idea what he went through. It was unbelievable. I was so impressed and touched with what Mom did, even though I felt bad for those ladies. But Mom meant it. She said no one hurts her kids. Now, as my back strengthened, so did my view of life. For the 6 months I was laid out on my back, I grew to appreciate the little things in life that one takes so much for granted. When we get home, my body again wrapped in a body cast from my neck to my pelvis. Mom asked what I wanted to do. We were sitting in the kitchen, and all I wanted to do, I told her, was to simply get up, walk by myself to the kitchen sink, and get my own glass of water, all by myself. I wanted no one to help me, no one get the glass out of the cupboard, no one pour the water into the cup. Let me do it myself. For 6 months, everything was given to me, and I wanted so much to do something for myself. That tiny glass of water, which I filled by myself, meant so much. Finally, freedom. By the way, the next day, guess where we went? To the barber shop.
Oh, I've been so lucky and I've been so blessed. In spite of my failings, I've found success.